The clamp settings in the sampling section have to do with limiting the energy in your scene. And so to demonstrate this, I'm going to use 100 samples for rendering, and first do a render without clamping. And then jump to slot 3, and let's take the clamp value of both direct and indirect up to 1. Well, isn't that pretty cool? We have almost no noticeable noise in our scene, and we're only at 100 samples. We're at 36 seconds to render that frame. Before we were at 34 seconds, almost 35, with all this noise, but now with just an extra second of render time, we're almost noise-free. However, our render does look more flat now, specifically in terms of these specular highlights. Whereas before, if we look at this chrome section of our orb model, it's catching our area lamp directly in the reflections, and that makes for a very hot highlight. Also, in our monkey head, we see a hot specular highlight and just more illumination in general. If I switch to the clamped version, it's darkened quite a bit and we can't see any specular highlight. So what this tells us is that a lot of the noise in cycles comes from the energy in the scene, which is most relevant in the reflections, and also the caustics, which is the effect of light passing through transparent and refractive objects, causing the light to bend and transform as it exits the other side. And so what the clamping does is it takes that energy and gives it a ceiling, gives it a limit. This is good because it obviously results in a more noise-free render, but it's bad in that it's much less physically accurate than it was without the clamping. Again, here is no clamping, and aesthetically, the image just turns a little bit flat without those specular highlights. So let's try changing our clamp direct and indirect to 5 instead of 1, and let's render that in, let's say, slot 1. All right, here we're starting to compromise a bit. If we switch to slot 3, the noise level is pretty low, even though we do have a little more noise introduced into the scene, namely the shadow of this cup, going back and forth a couple times. But we're also getting the specular highlights back, at least somewhat. Notice on the monkey head, it's still not quite as strong as it was without any clamping, but it is stronger at a clamp value of 5 than it was at a clamp value of 1. And also the translucent subsurface scattering material is picking up more light at a clamp value of 5. And so this is the game to figure out how to strike that balance between quality and speed. And with the clamp value in particular, a technique you can use to help find that sweet spot is to jump to our unclamped version, that was slot 2. And in the UV image editor, if I right click and hold, you'll see all these numbers pop up at the bottom of the window. And these are all color values based on the pixel that I'm hovering over. You can see right about here the actual color of the pixel. And the only number I'm interested in is the second from the right. It's this V, which stands for value. And so this kind of tells us the energy of that pixel. So if I hover over the hot spot that's coming from our light reflection, you can see this value fluctuates from between 3.8 all the way up to basically 5. Here we're at 4.8. And that's how I knew to go to a clamp value of 5, because I had explored the scene while rehearsing, and that at least gave me a ballpark value to start the balancing process. But I think I might be more comfortable at a clamp value of 10. Let's see what that looks like instead. And so as you can expect, our specular highlights come back a little bit better, but so does our noise. And so thankfully, the clamp settings are not the only options we have for optimizing the render. And honestly, it's more of a last resort for me. Because it affects the physical accuracy so much and is dangerous for making the image appear flat, I generally try to optimize the render before ever touching the clamp value. And if I just can't get it where I want it, then I'll start to clamp. But you notice that I've been changing both direct and indirect clamps at the same value. You absolutely have the freedom to change those independently. Clamp direct means the light that's coming from a lamp source, whereas the indirect lighting is from the light after it starts to bounce around the scene. And now below our clamp settings, we have the pattern, which by default is set to Sobel. We do have another option, correlated multi-jitter. And so if I go back to, let's say, frame 8 and turn off clamping and change our render settings to 100, or no, let's go to 10. For the sake of speed, let's do a render with Sobel, jump to slot 7, and then do a render with correlated multi-jitter. And then jump back and forth. There's really no change in quality, but the noise pattern jumps around. And also in the cup here, we get a little bit of brightness that's different with the correlated multi-jitter than it is with the Sobel. But the main difference in my experience is here with the correlated multi-jitter, we're at 6.02 seconds, With the Sobel, we're at 5.9. So a small difference in render time, but a difference nonetheless. And I'm not sure I see the value in correlated multijitter over Sobel. And so since it's the default, I usually leave it at Sobel. And so now that we have overviewed these settings, up at the top we do have a couple presets, one for previewing a render and then one for suggesting final render settings. You can also add your own. And then right here we have square samples. All this does, if we enable that, is instead of rendering 10 samples here, it's going to render 100. So it's going to multiply this value by itself, squaring it. And same for the preview value. So I guess this is a way to keep the numbers a little bit lower, at least visually. I personally think it's kind of confusing. I'd rather just see explicitly what the samples are and set them explicitly myself. But that's totally preference. And finally, this path tracing integrator setting. We have two options. The default is set to path tracing, but we also have branched path tracing. So if we click on this, it's a more advanced way to fine-tune the samples of the render. Instead of having one overall sample value, it breaks our sampling down into the different rendering components like diffuse, glossy, transmission, ambient occlusion, several different options. But I don't recommend this for beginners. And even myself, I don't use branch path tracing much. I just stick with the default path tracing. It's much easier to have one overall sample setting. And so that's it for the sampling section. Next, we'll look at light paths.